All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, the land of plaid and coffee and PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and real quick, just an update. I am actually going to be going back over and kind of revising the videos here. I know that as I've gotten better with this and a little less nervous, a little more less of the hacking should occur. Some of that throat clearing should be gone. However, I'll tell you this real quick. I will never apologize for the coffee sipping. If you haven't had any Sasquatch coffee, then you have no idea what I mean. But if you have, then you'll know. But what I've decided to do is I'm going to take some of the, some of the that first year or first season of the encounter stories here and bring them back. Don't worry, I'm going to continue doing the new reports and stories that come to me and turning those into those awesome campfire-like stories for you every other week. That's still going to continue. I just wanted to do this. Plus, I'm going to be putting this out on podcast pretty soon as I re-record these and get them back to you. So, without further ado, let's get on with the very first revised PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. This one is actually one of my favorites. This came to me from a person who's actually had his story in his encounter story in a book, report book. It was kind of an educational piece, and not to mention he wanted to share it here because he really enjoys PacWest Bigfoot, and I want to say thank you so very much, sir. Dad and 3 kids escorted away by Bigfoot near the Clackamas River. This one is a true encounter. It happened in the mid-1980s. I am the father of 3 kids, and one day, while heading out to fish on the Clackamas River in Oregon, we were escorted away from our favorite fishing hole by a Bigfoot. I have told my story before, and I believe it was published somewhere online and offline a year or so ago, if I remember correctly. Either way, here is what my children and I not only witnessed that day, but what we went through during this Bigfoot encounter. Fishing with the kids. I am a family man first and foremost, and as far as this family man is concerned, between a good Seattle Mariners home game and fishing or camping, there is nothing more I love to do with my kids than be with them. Fishing has been one of our favorite things to do of all, and for the 2 girls, it beat baseball games easy. Our family, my family, are part Native American, the local Clackamas tribe to be exact. Yes, we have our stories to tell of this creature, or better yet, an animal called Bigfoot, or Sasquatch. But it is still a whole other experience, however, to come face to face with one. That day was the scariest time in mine and my kids' lives. Even more than when my wife and our youngest daughter got into a pretty nasty car accident a few years prior to this encounter. Yes, they both came out of it almost without a single scratch. But it could have been worse, much worse. You should have seen that old Ford. It was a pretzel. However, this incident was different. We were totally, literally, about 10 to 12 feet from the largest, scariest looking animal I'd ever seen. The old tales and stories I had heard growing up did no justice with what we saw that day, especially when it came to how enormous and dangerous this Bigfoot or Sasquatch could be. Did we go fishing for Bigfoot? We piled into the old Datsun pickup truck that spring morning. We call it the Little Lemon, to tell you the truth. However, I have to mention this. That truck was never a lemon in the sense it would give me issues. Actually, it was just the opposite. That thing was a little champ of a mini truck. Back then, there was a little room for all of us in the cab. So I put together a makeshift seat belt and a little chair for my son in the bed of it. He was older, 12 at the time, and the trip would only take 20 minutes from where we lived. Back then, things like that were okay, and personally, I think it is still a fine thing to do with young people of a certain age. But let's not get into the politics of seatbelts, Dave. I have an incredible encounter here. As I was saying, we love fish. It was something my dad did with me, and it is a pastime and hobby I wanted to share with my kids, and maybe, and eventually they did, it would become a family ritual that my children carry on with their grandkids. Being Native American, well, half Native American, fishing is not just a pastime or a sport, it is also a rite of passage. It is something that is a part of my family's past and culture that is full of importance, pride, and history. And I wanted to share that with my kids. What I did not know, or at least did not take seriously for a long time, were the other rites of passage. We Native Americans have known about it for literally centuries. A creature, an animal called Sasquatch, and the reality of it. The perfect day. That day was perfect. A warm, late spring morning without a cloud in the sky. We had set out rather early, but not as early as I usually like to. Hey, as I said, I was taking 3 kids with me. It takes a bit to get them going. We were going to our favorite little spot along the Clackamas River, where it would basically flow into some slow-going, almost pools, if you will. We pulled up, and I had my son start unloading the ice chest and the 2 tackle boxes. Of course, my 2 daughters grabbed the fishing poles out of the back of the truck, and I gathered up a couple backpacks, which one was full of clothes, just in case the girls and my boy got too wet and needed to change, plus a towel or 2 the wife slipped in. The other contains some first aid supplies and any extra snacks my wife also decided we might need. She was always very thorough with getting us the things we might need while out there. We were parked in a turnaround at the end of an old dirt logging road with a metal rail-like guard blocking the rest of the unused road. I remember when it was used as a young man back then. As a matter of fact, I had a summer job up here once setting chokers with my dad for a logging company not far past where we were going to be that day. We hopped over the rail and started our last bit of the journey. The walk, or better yet, the hike, would take about 15 minutes or so, depending on the mood of the kids and the playfulness that ensues on these types of family outings from time to time when we were all together like this. And of course, there was some playing around, a little too much here and there, if you ask me. We were about 10 minutes in when our worlds were rocked. Not shattered, just rocked as something from what was moments before just part of our native lore came out of nowhere. As I said, we were heading into a part of the river that seems to be more like slow-moving pools, and personally, I believe this Bigfoot had young down there, down near them, maybe fishing or eating at the time. And just so you know, on one side of the road, the left side, walking west, you had a semi-steep slope that met the river about 30 yards down or so. On the right side was all mountains, or at least huge hillsides that were, and are still, thick with pine trees, alders, and thick brush that you can hardly see past. The road itself was not as wide as it once was. Today it is more like an oversized trail with tall grass and bushes that butt up to the middle part of the well-worn old road. We were coming around a bend when my 2 daughters stopped dead in their tracks and at the same time gasped as if in utter awe and total fear. If it was not for me noticing them gasp and stop at the moment, I swear I might have walked right into a monster, and who knows what would have happened then. I turned around to see my son staring at a gigantic monster not 10 feet away from us. I wish I could say I got a great look at the face, and while I did get a pretty good look, it did not last as long as I remembered. But I did remember what my grandfather said all of a sudden. Do not look directly at them. Look down and move slowly. If it were not for my grandfather telling me the stories once in a while, well, I would not have known what to do. His words would come to my mind quickly that day. However, at that moment, I was staring at an animal, a creature that really did have a man or ape-like qualities to its face. The nose, however, was not as flat as some say. The brow was heavier, I think, than a gorilla's, and the mouth and the eyes were very human-like, for the lack of a better comparison, I suppose. It was at that moment that it made a low but deep growl and gave us a very menacing look. You could feel that growl, to tell you the truth. It was intense, to say the least. It seemed to just vibrate right through you. It was at that moment that my mind came back to the present and the fact that my children were starting to sob and cry under their breath. As a father in a situation like that, I have to tell you, you feel rather powerless, as if you were in a car accident and watching everything happen in slow motion, and you can't do anything to stop it. My wife, upon reflection of her accident, said that is exactly what it felt like. Everything slowed down for a split second, but you were still helpless to do anything about it. Escorted from the scene. I had to calm them down, especially my daughters. They were starting to literally cry and sob so loudly, it seemed to be getting the attention of this creature. And yes, at that point, I knew it was a Bigfoot. I have to say, it was scary looking. I was freaked out as my kids, although I tried not to show it at the time. But looking back today, as a Native American, I wish to say I believe I was truly blessed to have this encounter, although I was not sure we would live through it at the time. I started to wave my hand behind me and made a hushing sound in hopes to get my daughters to move closer behind me and to get them to quiet down. I know that sounds a bit mean or weird, but in a situation like that, and this thing looking at them as their sobs grew louder, it was the least I could have done, I think. I then whispered softly to my son to move slowly next to me as I looked into its face. I know I was not supposed to, supposedly, but I did. The face was not exactly covered with hair. Between the nose and the lower brow of the forehead, which eventually led to a slightly cone-shaped head, was almost absent of hair, revealing an almost dark, coal-like skin tone. The brow was thick, I remember, and yes, the eyes, while sunken in below the thick brow it had, were in fact rather big and black. It almost looked human. I could see some of its teeth, as it was not happy we were there and was giving us an almost scowling kind of a look, with its mouth partially open. They have blocked teeth like ours, you could say. At least the ones I could see were. I have read of them having canines, but I never noticed any at that moment. The nose was not really like a gorilla's. In fact, it was more human-like than primate. It was the heavy brow line that gave it a primate-ish look. The feet, I noticed, were covered with hair. However, I could see large, dark, cracked here and there chipped toenails. They were much like ours as well, not claw-like as I had heard elsewhere later. They just looked like dirty old big but unkempt-looking toenails. And the feet. This thing was at least 3 heads bigger than me, putting it around 9-foot range, and the feet had to be at least 16 to 17 inches long, and that's a rough guess. As my son moved behind me and the girls followed suit, the creature seemed to turn its upper body, looking back behind it, twice, within a few seconds actually. Then it would look back at us with that same menacing scowl. At that moment I remembered that what my grandfather had said to me so long ago, and I finally immediately stopped looking directly at this Bigfoot creature in the eyes. Finally. I turned my head down, and what I was looking at now was a torso of an animal that was built bigger and more muscular than any weightlifter I've ever seen or heard of. His chest and the muscles I could see below the 1-inch long hair was just unbelievably massive. The fear of what this thing was capable of was beginning to sink in as it turned again to look back behind it, and one of its massive arms came into sight. The arms were massive and extremely muscular. The left hand alone looked as though it could wrap itself around my neck and have fingers meet. And trust me, I am 6'1", and not all that skinny. I was really getting to a point of worry and fear, and it was at that point that I knew I needed to start moving away, even if it were at a snail's pace. Just me, my kids, and a fishing pole. I slowly drew out the fishing pole as my kids were now in back of me, and like a sword in hand, I held that thing out in front of me as we started inching backward altogether, back the way we came. For every few steps we took, though, that Bigfoot took one step and always seemed to be within 10 to 12 feet of us at all times. So I kept that fishing pole outstretched towards it, as if that would stop any attack that would come. Yeah, right. Well, at least it made me feel better. It took 20 minutes, give or take a few, to get back to within 10 feet of the old Datsun. The Bigfoot again turned its upper body from about the waist up to look behind it, and it had done that every minute or so as we backed our way upon reflection later on. That is when I realized that maybe, just maybe, it was doing the same thing I was doing at the moment, trying to keep my kids safe. Maybe its offspring were down by the river at that moment. I would never know, but that was the feeling I got. And one I still feel to be true today. My son slowly walked over to the passenger door and motioned for his sisters to get in. He also got in the cab himself, and even though that would leave little room for me, at least it was enough to get in and drive away, I thought. Comfort in the cab was not on my mind at that moment. I still kept my eyes focused near the torso of the Bigfoot before me, and I slowly but surely made my way to the driver's side door, opened it, and closed it behind me, and ever so gently. It still sat there as I looked at its face one more time. I could tell that it was not happy we were still there, and this time the teeth were showing even more. I turned over the car, and the noise made the creature take a step back. At that moment it growled again, and this time it was a much louder growl, not a scream or a holler, just a fierce, angry, deep growl I could hear over that little engine. I backed up slowly, very slowly. That Bigfoot was twice as tall as that truck, and I knew that if I was to move too fast, it might set that thing off, and it would smash this little pickup, and with me and the kids in it. But I pulled away, and they were safe, finally. On the road again. We finally reached the main highway, and wouldn't you know it, a car passes by going 55 miles an hour. I thought to myself they had no idea what just happened to the people in the little faded lemon-colored Datsun pickup they just sped past. Neither could I tell you the truth, the shock of what I was starting to feel at that moment was just, well, I still can't explain it. I knew I had to keep calm, though, and so I did. I took a moment, looked down at the floorboard, and breathed in and out for a few seconds before putting the truck into first gear and leaving the scene entirely, but not before looking in my rearview mirror, knowing I would never fish in that area again. The kids continued sobbing for a few more minutes, but eventually it had turned to tears of relief and joy, I think. My own heart and blood pressure seemed to have finally settled down as we cruised along. Like I said above earlier, I do feel rather blessed to have had this encounter, but just so you know, I do not think I would want to have it again, especially with my children around. These things, these creatures, these Bigfoot are real. They exist, and I have come to believe that this part of Oregon is a hot spot and has been for a long time now. If you are looking for a place to poke your nose around Bigfootin', I suggest the Clackamas River area, especially outside of the Escorted area. But that is my story, Dave. Thanks, Billy.